Hello, I'm Britt Udison, Executive and Artistic Director at the Loft Literary Center. Welcome to this live stream at Virtual Wordplay. I'm so glad you're here with us. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about what brought us here today. For the last year, the Loft staff has been working hard to put together an outdoor book festival that would have gathered 100 authors with 10,000 visitors in our neighborhood in downtown Minneapolis. As COVID-19 hit, we knew we had to think about everything we do differently, especially this festival. While we were disappointed that we wouldn't be able to gather in person, we became even more committed to supporting writers, celebrating new books, and finding new ways to assert the connective power of the written word. In a time of anxiety, we want to offer a powerful event for readers, writers, and booksellers. When we first approached our sponsors, their first question was, what is a virtual festival? And to be honest, we didn't know. Our founding partners, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune, agreed to make a leap of faith with the Loft. With courage, generosity, and vision, they have worked alongside us to figure out what this virtual festival might become. We are grateful to our sponsors and donors. Their generosity is incredible, but it is not enough. We believe it is essential, especially during a health and financial crisis, to offer programs that are free and accessible to all, but that has led to a significant revenue loss. A live event would have included ticket revenue, beer sales, exhibitor fees, and additional sponsorships. The Loft is not closed. We continue to offer classes, fellowships, conversations, support for readers and writers in addition to this festival. We are here to support the literary community, and we ask that you continue to support us. If you are able, please consider making a contribution to the Loft today. Thank you for being here.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this Wordplay event. I'm Rachel Young, I work at the Loft Literary Center, and today I'm chatting with Rebecca Dinerstein Knight and Quan Barry about their glorious new novels, HEX and We Ride Upon Sticks. I'll introduce these two in a second and we'll get started here, but I also wanted to take a sec to thank our presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and the Star Tribune, for making our Wordplay Festival possible. Wordplay is just one of the many programs that the Loft offers for readers and writers year-round. And in fact, you can check out our website right now. It's loft.org to take a peek at the virtual creative writing classes for youth and for adults that we have coming up this summer. Many of these programs, like our classes and events, Wordplay, are made possible thanks to the generosity of our literary community. So if you're able, please do consider making a gift to support arts programming through the Loft year-round, and there should be a link on your screen somewhere. And you should also see a link there somewhere, wherever you're watching, to purchase both of our authors' books today from our friends over at Moon Palace Books in Minneapolis. Support your indie bookstores and our authors, buy their books, there's a link. And if you're watching somewhere that's not Crowdcast, there's a link on the event page for this on our website. And finally, we'll be taking audience questions at the end of this event here. So at any point when you're watching, feel free to type your question into the comment section or the chat function in Crowdcast, and we'll get to those at the end. So Rebecca and Quan will dive in here after I just take a minute to sing your praises. Rebecca Dinerstein Knight is the author of 2 novels, HEX and The Sunlit Night, and a collection of poems, Loft. Her screenplay adaptation of The Sunlit Night featured at Sundance in 2019, and she's reviewed restaurants for The Village Voice and novels for the New York Times Book Review. Her essays have appeared in a whole bunch of places, The New Yorker Online, The Guardian, The New York Times, no big deal, and elsewhere. And she lives and writes in New Hampshire. And Quan Barry was born in Saigon and raised on Boston's North Shore, and is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of 4 poetry books and 2 novels, including We Ride Upon Sticks. A decorated poet, she's received NEA fellowships in both fiction and poetry, and joins us today from Wisconsin. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Thanks,
Rachel. What a treat. So I'd just love for y'all to just kick us off real quick by giving like that requisite book elevator pitch just to get us all square. So what are your novels about? What are we talking about today?
Take it, Quan. Do you want to go?
So sure. So We Ride Upon Sticks basically is set in 1989, and it follows the Danvers women's varsity field hockey team as they try and make it to the state championship, using perhaps a little bit of black magic. And just what I'll say really quickly is that the town of Danvers is an actual place. It's my hometown. And 300 years ago, Danvers was actually part of Salem. It was then known as Salem Village. And it's actually the area in Salem where many events happened that sparked the Salem witch trials. And so about 50 years after that, Salem Village decided to change its name to Danvers. And so now it's called Danvers. But most people know the Salem witch trials and they only think of Salem. But again, Danvers is, like I said, is where many of those things began. So.
Very cool.
Cool. Hex is a double love triangle of hexagons. So you've got 6 people falling in love with each other at the same time. They've got to bone it out, basically. And at the center of it are some poisonous plants that the central character is attempting to sort of disarm with their own antidotes. So there's a lot of botany. There's a lot of interpersonal dynamics. It's pretty quick and voice driven, and it's just like a little snack for you. That's the pitch.
It is a little snack. It's a full meal. These are just such lovely books, and I love a campus novel. And both of these really are like kind of different takes on campus novels. Rebecca, your book is about a grad school cohort. Quan, yours is about a field hockey team in high school. And with books like this, I just have to wonder, what about your own high school or grad school experiences kind of enchanted those settings for you? In a good witch way or in a bad witch way?
So in thinking about it, like I said, so my book actually takes place in my hometown. I actually was fortunate to give a reading there right before COVID-19 hit. I actually went back to my high school. I gave a reading. A lot of my friends who I actually played field hockey with came. So there are many ways in thinking about like high school, particularly in a very specific time, like the 1980s, very much influenced how I thought about this book. In thinking about the places mentioned in the book, it's 99% accurate. So for example, the teen kids hang out at these various restaurants like Rocco's or Supreme's Roast Beef. That's like where we hung out in the 1980s. And those places actually still exist. And so it was really important to me to capture elements of what it was like to be a high school kid in Danvers in this particular time. So, and it's also true that my friends in many ways, aspects of them made it into the books as well. So high school, thinking about high school again is an important element of this book, yeah.
Do you feel like this is your field hockey team? Like when you're writing this, is it like...
I think legally I'm supposed to say no, it's not my field hockey team, but yes, it is my field hockey team. So when I actually saw us all just back in March, we were actually talking about like, yeah, in the summer, if things loosen up, we should all get together and hit a few balls around. Interestingly enough, I was actually interviewed by the National Field Hockey Association, which usually I'm used to doing interviews that are literary, right? And so they were asking me all these questions about sports and athletes. And I realized I didn't really have any answers because I didn't think of myself as an athlete or things like that. But one of the questions that they asked me got me thinking about like the long-term impact of sports. And I realized that in many ways, I played field hockey with many of these women like 30 years ago. and yet we're all still such great friends because we really did make a bond that really has lasted through the time. So, you know, some of the people who came to my reading, I literally have not seen in 30 years, and yet seeing them again, it was just like old times. Like I knew who they were, like I knew their hearts, like in the best ways. And so I think, again, just the bonds that one develops by playing sports, or even just thinking about high school more broadly, hopefully I captured some elements of that in the book.
Yeah, love that. Definitely. Some like groupthink happening there that definitely comes through.
Yeah, that sounds so fun. My book is also set in my hometown, which happens to be New York City. I was born and raised in Manhattan, which is sort of bizarre, but I didn't know it until I left the city. But it was sort of a pleasure to go back there. My previous novel and book of poems were both set in the Arctic of Norway, which is about as far from Manhattan as you can get. So it was nice to sort of return to my home turf, which allowed me actually to not focus on it. I wanted this book to be a psychological drama and not a place-based exploration of geography. Salem and I was very much about images and about landscape. And I really wanted this to be a human person-to-person story. So for me, the easiest way to do that was to put it somewhere I knew so well and so comfortably that I didn't have to spend the book's energy figuring out the setting. So within that, I knew that I wanted one of these characters to be pursuing graduate work, and that landed her in this particular botany grad program. But I will actually say that the campus element of it is less central than the citywide element of it, just insofar as she has a very strong connection to her mentor and to some classmates, but she's also moving around Red Hook. She's moving from neighborhood to neighborhood. It's not restricted to the campus grounds exactly, especially because she's been expelled. So the relationship between, I mean, New York City campuses are so bizarre to begin with because they don't get to enjoy the kind of privacy or sprawl that a lot of other campuses have architecturally and spatially in cities that are less crowded. So to be in a school in a city creates like a couple of concentric frames, and it was fun to just zigzag between them. Yeah.
Like that. Yeah, I think those things definitely, I don't know, that like very personal tie to, you know, where these are coming from, setting wise, you can definitely feel that come through in the narrative, but there's also some pretty like specialized research, I feel like, that went into both of these novels, like beyond the setting and beyond like the personal attachment to it. Go for it. Like in Rebecca, in your novel, there's all this like very intense like botanical information about different plants and poisons and antidotes. In Quan's novel, there's a lot of backstory around the Salem witch trials and around, I mean, as we're saying, like even just the specifics of like the small businesses and the hangouts in this town. What were your research processes like? I wonder, you know, in combining that, like, this is a place I know so well with this is a topic I maybe do. So yeah, what were your research processes like, and how strict were you about, you know, getting it right?
Yeah, so I did hear the question. I'm sorry, my phone was just ringing and I was like, oh no, it'll probably be somebody leaving, like my parent or my mom calling and leaving some kind of completely inappropriate message like, I see you on the computer. So I just thought, I'll just nip that in the bud before it starts. But yeah, when it comes to research for this particular book, I have to admit, luckily, I feel like I didn't really do that much research in more traditional terms. A, because I grew up in this place and time. B, because if you grow up in Danvers, you sort of are steeped in the history of the Salem witch trials. You know, as a kid in elementary school, you go and you take various tours and you see various sites and you learn all about it in ways in which I'm sure kids in other places don't. And so I always had that body of knowledge in me, and I was always interested in thinking about how, if you took the very same girls from 300 years ago and you placed them 300 years later, what kind of options, what kinds of lives are they living, you know, those kinds of things. The one thing that I did have to research just a little bit was the idea of, you know, who the actual victims of the Salem witch hysteria were. It was important to me that if I was going to be writing about witchcraft and about the Salem witch trials, that it be historically accurate with respect to like what happened to people, you know, their names, their ages. You know, there's a scene in the book where I actually talk about what Halloween used to be like in Salem in the 1990s. It's changed, but I wanted to document, you know, the history again of what happened, how the towns themselves have sort of changed over time. It used to be that if you were actually in Salem during Halloween, that there would be people gathered who would actually who were anti-witch, basically. So it's true that there's a scene in the book where pagans, Wiccans, you know, are marching Halloween night, and there are bystanders lined up to yell at them. That doesn't happen anymore. Again, that was like in the late 80s, early 90s. But like I said, so for me, the kind of research that I wanted to incorporate was to make the place, to be true to the things that happen to actual people. So that was important to me.
Yeah. My research started from a place of wondering. I had a job maybe 7 years ago in a rose garden back in Norway, where every plant was labeled in either Norwegian or Latin. So I didn't know what anything was, and I didn't know if I could touch it, let alone eat it. But it was all super beautiful and super compelling and attractive. And it just made me think, how did mankind ever figure out what we could use for our own purposes, what we could grind into wheat, what is toxic and what is nourishing, and how those sometimes appear identical and sometimes one is masquerading as the other. And that basic navigation through unlabeled resources started to feel pretty miraculous, that we had ever come to understand what we can and can't touch. And it also started to resemble romantic relationships, just insofar as what's attractive is so often different than what's right. So I wanted to sort of put those side by side. And I had a lot of fun designing the romantic relationships in this book, but I had a lot to learn about the botany. Chemistry was my worst subject in school, and botany is an extraordinary field that requires such specialization. And I too wanted to look at some of the herbal and witchcraft backstory to a lot of these plants and how they've been treated over time, how they were looked at historically, the earliest uses of them medicinally. And there's such a wealth of information available on these questions. So it was a pretty wonderful couple of months just really reading as much as I could about the plants that had made sense for these characters to be working with. I consulted a horticulturalist and a chemist and a couple of people just to make sure I was kind of getting my bulbs and my seeds right and my times of year right and my lamps right. I mean, it's so technical, and it did require a fair amount of fact checking, but I also think that it's wonderful to be writing a novel where the primary experience is not one of scientific communication.
Sure, yeah.
It is ultimately an aesthetic experience. So just trying to make sure that it's grounded in responsible research, but not letting that take the front thrust was a balance. But it was still so much fun to work on. Yeah.
I would just add really quickly, because you just mentioned about fact checking, and I often think like with fiction, like, well, how do you fact check fiction?
Yeah.
Obviously you're saying that with a book that has botany in it, you definitely want to do that. And thinking about my book, I didn't think there would be like any real fact checking to do in certain kinds of ways, and yet I felt bad for the woman who ultimately was the copy editor for it, because it took her twice as long as it normally does, because she fact checked every place, everything that happened in the 1980s, right? So for example, I have at the mall, there used to be a restaurant called Salad and she couldn't find, she's like, I can't verify that this restaurant ever existed, but like I know because my sister had a job there, Or at one point she sent me like this crazy note that the fact checker did saying, I had a character in the book who had sewn a prom dress. And I said that the prom dress was like McCall's pattern M2467 or something like that. And she wrote back, she's like, there's no prom dress, McCall's number, to be like, so she just really went to town. And in a way, I'm glad, because for people who do read at that kind of level where they pick up those small kinds of things, it makes the experience more authentic for them. So I felt really, appreciative to have somebody who looked at it at the level of, small details like that. So
It's so wild. Was that something that you wanted from your book? Like, were you asking, like, I want you to read this for accuracy, or were they just like, this needs to be true?
Yeah, no, I wasn't expecting it. So I don't know what, Rebecca, what your experiences are, but when you get that book back from the copy editor, like you want it to be clean. You're hoping, like, I hope it comes back and there's so few things that will, as opposed to, oh my God, I've got my work cut out for me. It's true, I got it back. And they always use, the comment section in Word. And then you just see like all these comments. You're like, oh my God, you know what I mean? So Rebecca, I don't know if you had a similar kind of experience.
Yeah, I'm like shaking my head like a crazy person because I've had such an identical experience with both books. Flabbergasting. The copy editing it's extraordinary. It's like, it's such a Herculean effort, and it takes so much work, and it's so detail oriented, and it's super impressive. It's also just mind-boggling. Like, I remember similarly with Sunlit Night, there's a ferry that crosses the Arctic Channel between like mainland Norway and the islands where I was living, and the brand of the ferry is the Hurtigruten. But each individual boat, like each vessel, has its own name, like the SS Midnight Soul or whatever. And I use the word Hurtigruten, which is how it's used. Like the locals, they say, I'm going to take the Hurtigruten tomorrow. They don't say, I'm going to take the SS Midnight Soul, because you don't know which boat is going to come. They're like, it's a fleet of boats. They all have different names. And the fact checker came back saying, like, it's not the Hurtigruten. That's the name of the company and not the boat. And it is sort of like, it does put you in a corner of not wanting, of like totally appreciating the correction and also not wanting to have to over explain why you made the original choice that you made. With Hex also, it was a real swamp because my narrator is pretty, sloppy, and so I didn't have her writing out certain numbers and certain units of measurements because these are diary entries, and I didn't think that she would be writing that way. But then you run into massive consistency problems. Rachel, sorry, this is such a different conversation than what you were anticipating.
You're fine.
But like keeping like if you spell out fluid ounces once, you have to spell out all units of measurements everywhere. And if you spell out 117th Street, are you going to spell out 59th Street, and so on and so forth? So those decisions actually threw me for a big loop, but such are the tiny joys of novel making. Yeah.
That is so wild. I honestly would not think that for a novel, like for fiction, that there would be that level of specificity.
It's wild.
Especially because I feel like the way that you both are using this like very factual historical information or botanical information is really like in the service of creating these kind of like witchy vibes, or like, I don't know, creating a sense of like enchantment around kind of like groupthink or hive mentality. Like in Hex, all the characters are really, personally and professionally entangled and academically entangled. There's like 3 different love triangles. It's this, it's almost like people are kind of spellbound together, kind of come into themselves in these kind of like classic coming of age story ways, with the support that being part of this bigger thing gives them. And actually, Quan, I'm wondering if you could just read a little bit from We Ride Upon Sticks that kind of touches on that group mentality kind of vibe.
Sure. So in this scene that I'm going to read from, basically the girls have been doing some research into witchcraft around the world, and they've discovered that sometimes soccer teams in some West African countries will bury good luck charms in the field in order to like influence their play. And so the girls decide, so one of them, her beloved rabbit has died. Her rabbit is named Marilyn Monroe. So you'll hear Marilyn Monroe mentioned. And so they've decided to bury Marilyn Monroe in their field. So this is basically the scene where that happens late at night. It was a little after 11:30 when we pulled up in the parking lot by the tennis courts in our armada of cars. In true funereal fashion, Girl Corey's Mercedes led the procession, bearing both little Smitty and our fallen hero, Marilyn Monroe. Somehow, the disfiguring scratch snaking down the car seemed an appropriate form of grief, like when people rend their clothes at the news of the death of a loved one. The rest of us parked in the lot, but Girl Corey drove her convertible right onto the field. At first, we worked by the light of her headlights. Lisa and Cult Jams all cried out, playing softly through the car speakers. But the night was beautiful and spangled, the skies radiant with the light of the full moon. One, Heather Houston, said people often called the harvest moon, though it was also known as the blood moon or the dying grass moon. After a few minutes, Girl Corey cut the headlights, and we did what needed doing under the harvest moon's glow, the clouds sailing along like silver waves. That night, there was no rending of clothes, no gnashing of teeth. Boy Corey had driven little Smitty's truck for her, as most of us didn't know how to drive stick. In the truck bed, there was a box full of tools used on the farm. There were 2 small hand shovels and 1 full-sized one, plus a rake. We took turns. Little Smitty sat and watched. In the moonlight, both the claw and Marilyn Monroe's mane of hair gleamed as if streaked with hoarfrost. We dug down about 3 feet. Coyotes had been spotted in the Woodville neighborhood where the high school was located, so Heather Houston handed AJ and Sue Yoon a flashlight and told them to find some rocks. When we were ready, we circled up like we did every day for stretching. Only this time there was already a looseness working its way through our limbs, a sense that out here under the night's mantle, we could be completely and utterly ourselves. Maybe this explains why Boy Corey started singing Candle in the Wind. Goodbye, Norma Jean. But the claw cuffed him fast on the side of the head, so Girl Corey popped our anthem in her car radio. Look out for number 1. Solemnly, little Smitty lowered her prized bunny into the hole we had dug right at midfield, officially sanctifying the earth as ours.
Thank you so much. Something that I think really helps to achieve that kind of like spellbound intertwinedness in both of your novels is the point of view that you use. So Quan, you're using the first person plural. It's narrated by the entire team as we. And in HEX, Rebecca, you're using the second person. You're writing to the narrator's writing to her advisor and using you to address her. And I mean, it's hard not to hear echoes of, in We Ride Upon Sticks, like the Jeffrey Eugenides, The Virgin Suicides, or in HEX, I Love Dick. So like, did you feel like you had those influences driving your novels? Did you feel like as you were creating that kind of like, almost like, it creates this sense of almost like incantation sometimes, speaking like to you in this like prayerful way, or speaking as we in this kind of like culty way. Did you find that it like drove that sense, or did you find it constraining ever as you were developing characters? And how did you decide to use those point of views?
Rebecca, do you want to answer this first?
Sure. Yeah, I've never done anything in second person before, and I can't say that I ever decided to with this book. It's just the devotional energy in this book is so strong that it wound up basically requiring it. I think of this book as sort of an exercise in devotion. The main character is committed to impressing, connecting with, establishing some sort of cosmic bond with her advisor, so with such fervent hope that she can't speak in any other way. I mean, her thoughts are addressed to Joan. So I wouldn't even say it's a typical second person, because the you is not the reader. It's not you walk down the street, you get in your car, and a sort of general inclusive reader enters the page way. It's a very specific character who's being addressed. It's one person. So I found that to relieve some of the friction of general second person, which can sometimes be disorienting within the narrative itself. Here it has a very, very, very local target. And that made it feel closer to somewhere between first and third. I mean, there's still a lot of the narrator's own voice in it. In fact, the whole thing is basically the narrator's own voice. So there's that first person quality, but then it also moves around between these 6 characters somewhat equally. So there's a third person zoom out that gets in there too. So those are the only reasons I was even able to sustain the second person, and why the second person was totally necessary and like gives the book its flavor. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about, again, voice and person and number and things like that. I always knew that I wanted the book to be written from first person plural. I just didn't know who was going to be the first person plural. I like to make the joke that there's no I in team. You always hear that, there's no I in team. And so I always kind of knew, like I said, that it would be first person plural. When I first started writing it, I thought actually that maybe it was going to be the freshman girls team. So if you ever play a sport, there's usually like the varsity team, the junior varsity team, and a freshman team. And I thought that maybe it would be the freshman team would be watching the senior girls. And because oftentimes, when you're a freshman, you're like obsessed with the senior girls. Like they seem so old, like they can drive, like they're adults, they're about to go off to college. And you often know things about the senior girls that they might not even know about themselves. And so I didn't write that much using the first person plural for freshman girls. And I just realized it just wasn't working. Then I tried again, not very long, but I tried maybe writing it from the point of view of the school in general, that the school was watching these girls and telling the story. And again, because you mentioned, Jeffrey Eugenides, the Virgin Suicides, in which those teen boys are watching the Lisbon family. And so I was very much thinking in terms of having like a collective who are watching these girls and what their actions are. But then after those 2 things didn't work out, I realized pretty quickly, no, like I said, there is no I in team. And it turns out that it should be the team who tells their own story. And then, so in doing that, it allowed me, I always like to have, at least of the 2 novels that I've written so far, I do like to have magical elements in my books. I think of it more in terms of magical realism than anything else. And so by having it be a first person plural voice that tells the story, it then allows that voice to begin to devolve into hive mind, into telepathy, into mind reading, those kinds of things, which just adds to the witchy element of the book. And there's also a way, I think, in which teen girls in particular, more so, and again, I'm not saying it's innate biological or anything like that, but you think that there's oftentimes a closeness among girls that maybe sometimes there isn't necessarily among boys. Like you oftentimes think of like best girl teen friends, like maybe they're so close that they can finish each other's sentences, or they can do things like, along those kinds of lines. And so it made sense to me that again, that these girls would have a bond so tight that they would be able to dip in and out of each other's minds.
Yeah, definitely. That does feel like it definitely comes through. And I something I really love about the characters in both of these novels too is that there are kind of these like quirky, eclectic casts of characters. It feels like really like an ensemble cast where everyone has kind of a role that they're filling. Everyone has like their quirk or their interest area or their like, on the field hockey team, like there's the team captain girl who's always eating a banana, and there's the girl who has big boobs, and there's the tomboy. And in Hex, you have all these characters have different research areas who are, like this type of professor, that type of professor, like this type of scholar. It also feels though that all of these characters are kind of pushing against the limits of the roles that they're supposed to play. I'm wondering if both of you can talk a little bit about how you built those characters and kind of built them around each other, because like you're saying, I mean, they're in both of these novels, it's these really kind of like the group itself as a character as well. So taking it down to that level of individuals, how did you build these characters and build them around each other?
Yeah, it was so fun to design. It sort of started as a math problem where I wanted these 6 figures in maximum exposure to each other, professionally, personally, romantically, sexually, intellectually. I literally started with 6 letters, A, B, C, D, E, and F, before they had names or personalities. And I wanted to think of like, what could each of these characters want from each other? And how could they go about defining themselves in relation to each other? And how could they go about sort of building their own selves, having seen what they find compelling or what they find disturbing in these strong personalities that surround them, which I sort of think is how a lot of social groups function. There's like this group construction of individual identities based on the examples we set for each other and the ways in which we envy and inspire each other and the things we get wrong about each other, and how easy it is to assume that somebody else is doing really well when in fact they aren't, or they think that you have something that they want. That sort of engine of misplaced jealousy and ambition and striving, and also the longing for a more substantial kind of connection, to me was sort of what made these characters move and want each other. And then on the specific level, it was just a sort of pleasure to give them areas of expertise and to give them their favorite foods and their favorite neighborhoods, and just to populate the world with the kinds of choices we make and the kinds of ways we define ourselves via our choices. That's a pretty general answer, but it really was nice to sort of deal in almost archetypical forms that way.
For sure. I mean, I think that's so interesting that like you even started, they didn't even have names. They were just letters that had like different kind of gravitational pulls toward each other, which I feel like feels very similar to kind of the like 80s teen movie vibe of all of these archetypical characters in We Ride as well.
Very much so, yeah. So I knew that the book, I wanted it to be structured around a team. There are 11 members on a field hockey team, and so I knew that each chapter was going to look at a different member. And I definitely, I definitely was thinking about 80s movies in the sense that, you have the different archetypes, right? So you have the sports jock, you have the brainiac, you have the arty girl, you have whatever, And so, as I mentioned, the book obviously takes place in the 80s, but it was important to me to look at the 80s in all its glory and all its terribleness, right? When you think back on a lot of those movies, like there's terrible things that happens. There's like casual racism, homophobia, what have you, all those kinds of things. And so I knew that I wanted to look more closely at some of the things that the 80s movies don't look at. And so I chose, to have the team demographically be composed of a certain group of people. I chose to give them each like a different kind of thing that they're struggling with, or that's going to ultimately become strength of theirs and help form, who they are. So I was interested in that. And I will say too, in thinking about characters, one of the things that I struggled with a bit, but I didn't overthink it, was because I do have 11 characters. And in many ways, you could maybe argue that the team captain is the main character, but in many ways, it really is an ensemble piece. And so when you write an ensemble piece with 11 characters, it's just hard to have your reader hopefully care about that many different people, and to also keep that many different people straight, right? And so I worked really hard to give each and every one like a vastly different characteristic. So again, as you mentioned, somebody eats bananas all the time, or somebody has this crazy hairdo, or somebody's, what have you. So that was definitely an aspect of something that I worked at.
Yeah. I cannot even imagine like keeping that many people straight. Like it's really helpful for me, even like with a book with so many characters who are so who are all struggling with their own things, to have that kind of like map at the beginning that's like, here's We Ride Upon Sticks, there's like
it's the graph. If you actually call it like a team. So if you actually had a graph for how a team looks, like it's the different positions. So it shows you all the different positions and then who the characters are who play those positions.
Yeah, very. It's like super. It's super fun to think about, like in writing these kind of like ensemble novels, like the ways that even like thinking visually about how they all fit together and how they're supporting each other comes into play in each of those ways. Okay, we're running a little short on time before we get to audience questions, but I did want to talk about how both of you are writing about women in your novels here. something that my friends and I have been kind of talking about lately is how during this like stay at home and shelter in place, we have these days where we feel like we're really like embodying that like real woman character in books where like, I don't know, they're like characters who are like relatable and real, but it's kind of like because they're a little bit gross and like you're not proud that you find them relatable, you know. And the characters that you all are writing about are not always super ladylike, and I would love to talk characters, but Rebecca, I just would love to have you read from a particularly like gross chapter that I really, really loved reading from HEX to kind of kick that off.
Sure. This is a chapter called Boogers, so that's what's going on. Boogers. These days, what I really like to do is to lie on the floor shirted and pantsless and relieve one or other nostril of a really good boog. I leave all boogers on the windowsill. In the morning, I wipe them up. They look so different dry, less lovable, easier to discard. My little trash can is full of them. Mishti says Nell is forgetting herself, but I say I've got world-class bugs. Don't worry, Joan. I check myself. I check myself and I wreck myself. Sometimes I make tortellini, and even if I make only half the bag, call it 1.5 portions, I pour it steaming into my bowl and I look at it and I think, nobody in the whole world deserves this much tortellini. I love it so much it doesn't need any topping. Each tortellinis is a self-sufficient packet of perfect food. I love best the unforgivably dank, tricolor, frozen kind, manufactured by mass brands that put ammonium bicarbonate in cracker meal into the ricotta stuffing. Tortellini that is probably unhygienic even while it's frozen. I can't believe I get to eat it. Same trouble with a box of Kraft spirals and cheese. A whole box feels like the ideal portion size to my body, but my mind knows it's supposed to feed 5 or whatever children, and to hog it is unconscionable sin. It's okay. I use the empty box as one brick in my temple wall. I don't mean my body as temple. We know my body to be a rectangle with rounded corners. I mean the temple I am building to worship life. One time in the cafeteria, I heard you telling Barry to stop eating. And even though Barry is fat, and even though I understand your point, and even though I had eaten, as I've said, more tortellini in my 31 years than any creature has ever merited in the history of the universe, it was almost enough to make me stop loving you. Unfortunately, only almost. I'm sorry I've become such a laziness, Joan. Your husband got me in big trouble, and now I feel cosmically shy. But if I can just speed up this binding process by a minor increment, we'll have made major progress, and I'll redeem our rejected lab, and Barry will have nothing on me, and the many sons will turn back into little boys, and Rachel will rest, and we will all be able to suffer and heal, and suffer and heal, and suffer and heal whenever we need to. Neutrality will be our new pet drug.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this chapter, the voice of your narrator is just so strong and resolute, and sometimes resolute in like her own grossness, and in just like the kind of defiance with which she's like not taking care of herself or is lazy or is not, isn't checking herself.
Right.
And I feel that both of you in your novels are writing to this kind of like imperfect or kind of like not so ladylike or even sometimes gross women characters. And I wonder how you think about that. Like I feel like we're in this moment now where people are writing about women in ways that are real. And do you feel like you're writing with that as a mission? Do you feel like you're just like, I don't know, like trying to just keep it real? Like what is the, I don't know, like how do you write a real female character who's maybe gross, but not in a gimmicky way.
Yeah, I mean, with this guy, I think it's a little bit of a false choice to begin with, the ladylike or not choice. It certainly wasn't how I approached Nell, because Nell, for all of her, Nell, for all of her sort of physical squalor, is hugely ambitious academically and very skilled, and takes her work very seriously and holds herself to very high standards in non-physical arenas. So I think I was never trying to create a character who simply rejected excellence, or who gave herself a break, or who was trying to argue for some sort of sloppiness as a way of life. It's just that Nell's values are pretty focused in academic and professional spheres, and that doesn't leave a lot of time for her to take up the values that might appear for others like more beauty related values or more cooking related value. You know, it's just choosing one place to apply yourself over the other. But I will say that all of the women in this book are working very hard and are very interested in their pursuits, whether or not they manifest as sort of classically feminine or not. And I think that's the truest way to write the contemporary female character, is to take her work, to prioritize her work, and to not have her be limited to whether or not she is classically feminine, because I don't know that we occupy the classical age of femininity anymore. So it doesn't, and that's not to say you can't. I mean, there's another character in this book, Nell's best friend Mishti, is classically physically beautiful and interested in fashion and interested in dance and all kinds of things that earn her more immediate lady points. And that's there too. And Nell hugely admires her for it. So it isn't by any means a villainification, if that's a word. When nobody's villainizing one set of values and nobody's particularly set on championing their own. It's just that they like what they like and they're working on what they're working on. And they love being together, these six people, I think, or love is a strange word, but they're sort of addicted to each other because they each have such different pursuits, and they can sort of marvel at each other, which is the richest kind of society. So I don't know, it was nice to just let people do their thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And thinking about it, I think the thing, you know, as I mentioned before, I've always been really interested in thinking about why the girls, the afflicted girls of 1692 acted the way that they acted. You know, in many ways, obviously, they didn't have a lot of options. It was probably understood that they would either be wives, mothers, you know, they could be indentured servants, you know, what have you. They probably had very small worlds in certain kinds of ways. And so, like I said, I was interested in thinking about, it's the same landscape, right? But what happens again when you take women and girls 300 years into the future? What kinds of things do they do? And so, growing up, it's true that I grew up in such a way that I did hear the word ladylike often mentioned to me by various members of my family. I'm like, oh, that's not ladylike, you know? And so I think in my book, the thing that I was interested in is the idea of girls who just aren't interested in convention in general. They're not interested in any kinds of conventions, right? Their primary goal is just freedom. And the question of like, what does that mean to be free? What does that mean to be free with it and to be a member of a community? Because you also have responsibilities to your community, you know, in that sense. And so they're trying to figure out like what it means to be authentically themselves, to understand what it means to be a free person while still having responsibilities, again, within certain structures. So that's definitely something that I was thinking about writing this book.
Cool. Totally. Well, awesome. Thanks so much, both of you. We have time to take a few questions from our audience who are writing in. So let me pull this up. Y'all ready? We've got a question from Steph, who asks, she says, you've talked about the research and some of the more tedious components of writing and publishing these books, but can you talk about what characters, scenes, or plot lines you had the most fun with?
Go for it, Quan.
Sure. So for me, I have to admit that my favorite chapter in the book is the chapter where they actually go to Salem for Halloween. So it's a chapter in which it only covers a day. Most of the other chapters cover more periods of time. So basically, it's one of the characters. It's her birthday. She's turning 18. She's becoming an adult. So there's a lot of things going on. You have this idea of what it means to cross into adulthood. You also have the idea that it's actually Salem and it's Halloween, and you see how Halloween is celebrated in Salem in 1989. You get aspects again of just geography. You know, the girls together. They end up meeting a group of boys, you know, in Salem. And so various things happen because of that. So for me in general, I just really enjoyed writing that chapter. It's also, I should mention, a shout out to my family because it is a small moment of research that I had to do. So growing up, I lived in Danvers, which is the town next to Salem. And so you would always just hear about these parties that would take place on Gallows Hill. Gallows Hill is allegedly where many of the people were actually hung back in 1692, but nobody is quite sure where Gallows Hill actually is. And now there's questions as to whether or not they were actually hung on a place called Proctor's Ledge. But anyway, I, being a nerdy brainiac in high school, not even brainiac, just being nerdy, I never went to any cool teen parties in Salem when I was growing up. So I never had been to Gallows Hill, but I always heard of it as this teen hangout. And so I had to go. So one day in summer, my brother was up from Texas with his family, and he had young kids. And so we all decided, let's go to Salem and let's just be tourists in Salem because it's so touristy. And so we actually drove around using the GPS trying to find Gallows Hill. And we did. And we ended up finding this big hill, and it's featured in the book. So that was a fun aspect of research that I got to do.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we haven't even touched on is that Quan and I both come from a poetry background. And so I think a lot of my favorite chapters in Hex have a kind of like rhapsodic rhythm to them. And all of the chapters in the book are really short, and some of them operate, sort of to use your word, Rachel, as like one incantation. And so the chapters that are the strangest and the most lyrical and the most like songs almost were the ones that just sort of pressed my earliest poetic buttons. But then I also got to write a lot of food into the book, which is a major thing I love to eat is food. And so there's just, and it's like New York City food, which I'm really nostalgic for now that I live in New Hampshire. So there's a lot of Chinese food, there's pizza, there's diners, there's, you know, as you heard, tortellini and cheese. And there's like a major scene that happens at a cheese board. And it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to just surround myself by those props. Yeah.
I love that. And actually, yeah, that is, I'm going to insert one more question about that, because I did want to ask both of you about, you both have backgrounds in poetry, have published poetry in the past. And I'm interested to know, like, I do feel like kind of some of these like magic or witchy elements, like plants and academia and sports, even like all of these things lend themselves in terms of like imagery and language you can use really well to poetry. How did you decide to go with prose and to go with a novel?
Yeah, I would say so. I've actually written poems about this topic. So in my very first book, which I published like in 2000, there's a poem specifically about a speaker who plays rugby and various things that happen from that, and also who plays field hockey. And the point of the poem is that the speaker is talking about her relationship to the sport and her relationship to her mother, and how her mother thinks that some of these sports are too violent, right? And so in some ways, like the themes of daughters and mothers and sports was present in that poem. I've also written a poem, again, about the Salem witch trials and about an actual place in Danvers, which is an actual memorial site that you can go visit. So that's also appeared in a poem. So I have written poems about them. I just knew that, and think about the novel, it's obviously a moment elongated in which I get to work a lot of themes into it. So, in the poem in which it's just about the speaker and her mother and sports, that's just one little slice. But obviously in the book, like I get 11 different players with 11 different mothers. And so it just gives you the opportunity to really just expand on that. And then just really quickly, I'll say too, that in thinking about this novel is my first novel, which is set in Vietnam, is actually very lyrical. I think some people, it's much more obvious that it's written by a poet in many ways. This book is obviously comedic, hopefully, knock on wood. And I will say that I don't feel like my poetry necessarily influences this book as much. I'm much more interested in just the idea of timing. And I don't think that timing, poets obviously oftentimes have great timing, but I think that timing is just, it's about writing in general. And so one of the writers that I super love, I'm not sure that people really still read him anymore because I'm sure he's put his foot in his mouth about many things recently as he's an older man, but that is Martin Amis. So Martin Amis, the British author, to me, he is a master of when it comes to humor, like how to create a sentence, like where to put different elements in it in order to get the most comedic value out of it. Just really quickly, like for example, he describes, not to turn the conversation political, but he describes Mitt Romney. And his description of Mitt Romney to me is just spot on. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but basically he says that Mitt Romney has the perpetual pained grimace of a man who's just shrugged on a too tight dinner jacket, yet who has a sprained shoulder. You know what I mean? So this idea that Mitt Romney always looks like he's in pain because he's wearing a too tight dinner jacket. I'm like, that's completely true. You know what I mean? So I don't think that that's necessarily particular to poetry. Like I said, I think it's just writing in general, but I'm definitely interested in timing and how to write things a certain way. So.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about melody. There's a lot of music in poetry, and being able to hear the melody of a sentence and to hear the total piece of the way the sentences come together is really important to me. And with Hex as a format, as a prose format, I loved it because it felt like I could do all three. I could be lyrical where I wanted. I could be very straightforward and prosaic in the prosaic sense of the word, where I wanted to be. And I could also be really dialogue focused. I was working on the screenplay of The Sunlit Night while I wrote Hex, and that's all dialogue, obviously. So I was in a bit of a dialogue frame of mind. And there are entire chapters that are only dialogue in Hex. And I really enjoyed that. And one thing I love about the novel is that it leaves room for all of those structures. So it's all in there, and I like that.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, a nice hybrid. Okay, you guys, we have like 4 questions to get through. Do you think we can do like lightning round audience questions?
Totally.
Awesome. Okay, so we have one from Kara who asks, how much of your plot did you have mapped out or outlined before you began writing? And did anything surprise you as you went along? Quan, you go first.
Lightning round. I never plan anything. Like I'm somebody, I actually enjoy writing myself into a corner and then figuring out how I'm going to write myself out. The thing that I did surprise myself about the ending. I wasn't quite sure how it would end. And when I got there, I was like, oh yeah, that's how it ends.
Love it.
Opposite. Every second of this book was planned in advance, and that really helped me chart through it because it is so geometric and there are these 6 characters in all of these permutations, and I really needed to keep track of it, and that having an overview allowed me to get to the end of it. But then what surprised me was getting to the end of it and figuring out what needed to be brought to the surface more and what needed more attention and more energy. But the initial outline, plotting the book from start to finish, really helped me get the first draft done.
Love it. It takes all types. Rebecca, did you have literal like pentagrams,
Yes.
like diagrammed and all your stuff?
Yes.
Wow. Talk about magical. Pam asks, what do you think is the special appeal of the magic element in your books, and what themes does the magic help bring out?
Rebecca, you want to try that?
Oh, okay. Beauty. For me, like magic is just a pathway to the beautiful and to the mysterious, and to a set of images and sort of moods that realism sometimes can't touch. So it was just a pleasure to be able to really max out the beauty and the strangeness of these flowers via their magical sides.
For me, magic brings out things in the characters, right? I think of it in terms of Dumbo's feather, right? So his feather, like he doesn't really need that feather in order to fly, but he believes that he does. And so what magic allows my characters to do is to become to believe more in themselves.
Love it. Okay. What do we got? We have Kareen, who asks a question specifically for Quan. Given that your book spoke about topics so literally close to home for you, was it an emotional journey to research, write, and put yourself in the shoes of these women who lived where you lived and went through such intense experiences?
I would say it wasn't difficult for me. I'm not sure why. Like maybe it should have been, but it wasn't. I think it's because I always do have that distancing, there's always an element of distance. And so some things are changed up. It's true that, for example, there are characters in the book who are women of color, who are living in a predominantly white environment, which was my experience growing up. So it allowed me to rethink some of the experiences that I had while growing up, while also being able to change and to rethink and to know what the consequences of various things were, which maybe at the time I couldn't think through, right? But now I have the lens of 30 years to know how those kinds of things affected me. So it's an interesting question, but yeah, no, it wasn't painful for me. If anything, it was fun and joyous because I realized ultimately like how much I was loved by friends and family and how much love I feel for them.
Oh, I love that. And there is also that kind of element of it's kind of this like self-aware, like I said, it's like an 80s movie, but with this like element of like self-awareness that can kind of like look back on itself and even criticize some of those tropes, which is very cool. And a final question for both of you. What are you both reading during the stay-in orders? And what are you writing? I'll add, if anything. No pressure, sorry.
Okay.
So I'm reading, and again, I just heard her name said for the first time, so maybe I've been mispronouncing it this whole time. Is it Hilary Mantel or is it Mantle? I don't really know. I heard it on NPR yesterday, but again, it's the third book in her Wolf Hall trilogy. So I'm reading The Mirror and the Light, and I'm really, really super enjoying that. I also did read Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown. So if people aren't familiar with that book, it's just really super smart and interesting. As far as what I'm writing, I'm working on a play. So yeah, COVID-19 has kind of stopped what was supposed to be happening with it, but hopefully it will still have a future in some way, shape, or form.
Very cool.
Yeah, there's so many great books coming out this year and they're all being rerouted in various ways. So I've just been reading some really exciting galleys. Justin Taylor has a beautiful memoir called Writing with a Ghost coming out, and Marie Helene Bertino's novel Parakeet is truly astonishing. And I'm really excited to read Megha Majumdar's book, A Burning. Those are all books that come out in June, July. And yeah, they're wonderful. And then I've been writing essays, and I got to write an essay on Vita Sackville-West, who was a contemporary and lover of Virginia Woolf. And that was one of the most fun research and writing experiences I've ever had. And I wrote an essay about a poetry mentor of mine, Mark Strand. And both of those were really wonderful to spend some time with.
Nice. Some time to meditate.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you both so much. This has been so great to chat. Thank you. Everyone watching at home, you can buy both of these books, and you definitely should, by clicking the link somewhere here, I think, on your screen. You can buy those from our friends at Moon Palace Books in Minneapolis. And while you're at it, you can also throw a few dollars our way at the Loft to keep programming like this possible year-round. This event and all of Wordplay is presented by the Star Tribune and St. Catherine University. Thanks to them so much for making this possible. We have another this week and then next week of Wordplay events before we are done for 2020. But you can watch everything, including this video. It'll be archived on our website, so you can go back and watch it, or share it with your friends and family, and to show them what the Loft is up to and what our wonderful authors have been writing. So thanks, Rebecca and Quan, so much for joining me.
Quan and Rachel and the Loft.
Yay, thank you. Thanks.